David Barr. Welcome back to your Essentials group on the book of Genesis. Here we come to our final session, and there is a lot to tie together here. And so I'll give you a quick recap of things because there's a lot. So in our previous session, session 9, we saw that Joseph had become a powerful man. He's now living in Egypt. And he's reconciled with his brothers when they came down to find food in the middle of a global famine. And there was this dramatic reunion that Colin described. And so he also told them, Joseph that is, also told them that he would take care of their families during this famine. And so in chapter 46, verse 5, Joseph's 11 brothers take Jacob and all of their families down to Egypt. And as I mentioned, Joseph has become extremely powerful. Scripture says he is the ruler of Egypt. It's quite a claim. And so he's a powerful man and a powerful empire. And he alone apparently has the resources to care for his father and his 11 brothers and their families. And so in chapter 46, we see this miraculous reunion between Joseph, who again was once thought to be dead and gone, and his father Jacob. It says in a moment that I think is just beautiful that Joseph fell on his father's neck and wept. It's amazing. So after the reunion, Jacob is brought before Pharaoh. And there's this wonderful moment where Jacob, who remember is an old man at this point, he's basically a backwater clan leader, he blesses Pharaoh, who's the king of the world. Just pause there. Here's this nobody blessing a major ruler. I think it's a nod to who the people of Israel really are. They're the special chosen people of God. So then Jacob not only blesses Pharaoh, he then blesses his 12 sons, which he has gathered around. Our reading says that these 12 are designated as the 12 tribes of Israel. 49:28 says that they are each blessed with a blessing suitable to them. That is, they're not all blessed in the same way, and they're set aside for different things. You could say that they're distinct and yet still one nation from one family. In other words, they are now a people. They're a people or a nation. And so here we see the fulfillment of this amazing promise that was given to Abraham back in chapter 15, and it was affirmed with Isaac and Jacob, and now with Joseph. And so we go from one man, Abraham, to 12 tribes created from nothing and miraculously preserved for purposes that exceed their own identities. And these 12 are proof that God's promise has endured. And so Jacob, the heel grasper, remember, he's satisfied. His sons and all their families are all accounted for and secure. They will endure through the famine and gain a position of great stature in Egypt. So we see that God was true to his promises. But Jacob does have one last request. He asks to be buried back in the land chosen for his people in Canaan. It says in the field of Ephron the Hittite. And this location might sound obscure and strange, but it's a very big deal. It's, if you go and look back, it's the cave where Jacob's wife Leah was buried. And it's also where Abraham and Isaac, both his father and his grandfather, are buried as well. And so this tomb was purchased by Abraham and was in fact the very first purchase that Abraham made in the Promised Land. And in this way, it is kind of like the original property of the people of Israel. So just think about that. It's the first place that belongs to God's people. And we'll come back to this, but it is important to note that this burial site is still famous today. It's called the Cave of the Patriarchs. It's some ways south of Jerusalem. And so Jacob breathes his last. It's given Egyptian honors, and he's embalmed, which is an Egyptian practice. And he's finally buried back in the Cave of the Patriarchs in Canaan, the promised land for the family of God. The point here is that Egypt is not his home. Egypt isn't Jacob's home, nor is it Joseph's home. But there's one final detail I want you to note, and then I'll move on to some more general reflections. The end of our reading says the Egyptians, together with the sons of Israel, mourned the death of Jacob. And I think we see in this a profound gesture of solidarity that Jacob and the people of God have become a blessing to Egypt. And how amazing is that? Just think about that. Of course, we know what will ultimately happen. One of the darkest periods of Israel's history will eventually happen here at the hands of the Egyptians. They become slaves in Egypt. But don't forget this moment. Don't forget the way that Israel blesses Egypt even before she suffers under their power. The people of God, it seems to say, have the capacity to bless the world even when they are in their weakness. That's amazing. So here are a few major concluding takeaways that I'd like for you to reflect on both in this chapter but also in Genesis as a whole. First is this. Notice that the covenant is fulfilled in a preliminary but observable way. You see, Genesis is not just about creating the world, but it's also about creating a people of God after the fall. We spoke all about that. And that's exactly what we see here. 12 sons over 12 tribes, not just a clan, but a small nation, a family that grows into a nation. Now, of course, the promise is also somewhat unconcluded. They've become a people, but they are not in the land that God has set aside. So there is more to come. It ends kind of like a cliffhanger. The people of Israel are still in Egypt. And I think it's, again, significant that the body of Jacob goes back to Canaan and is buried as a sort of symbolic guarantor. And that's, I think, what's so important about that cave. They're a people, and the promise is that they will have a home. So now, second, notice the narrative coherence of the Joseph story as well as its relatability. It's coming to a close. The whole Joseph story is coming to a close. The brothers sin violently against Joseph. Remember, threw him in a pit. He's sold into slavery. And this is almost reminiscent of Cain and Abel. And yet, in this amazing scheme of providence, they're forgiven. And not only that, but they're all reconciled back together. And they do it. They never fully trust Joseph. You'll see that if you keep reading. And yet they receive all the benefit of being associated with the most powerful man in the world. They get land and food and blessing. They get recognition and all the security of being a brother to Pharaoh's right-hand man. And so one thought is, how might we be like Joseph's brothers? And what might Joseph show us about Jesus? Remember, all scripture points to Christ, so mentally explore how Joseph might figure Jesus himself. Third, remember at the very beginning of this study, we spoke about how God's major plan to solve the problem of sin is Abraham, one person. God chooses this one man, Abraham, and then his family to become a people to carry forth a godly way of being human, a redeemed way of living in a broken world. And a question that has been lurking in the background all along throughout our whole Essentials classes is, will they be able to stay together? Will the family of God, will the people of God be able to endure and become a nation of God? And here at the very end of Genesis, we get this profound and resounding yes. You see, by God's mercy, at the end of Genesis, they've come back together. They have stuck it out as one people underneath God's purposes. And now they are reunited all together. And just pause for a minute. Think about all of the sin and the struggle and the drama that occurs between Abraham and now Joseph. And yet here they are, united under a brother who is willing to forgive and to reconcile at all costs. And they have become a people. 12 tribes, distinct, given each their own callings, but united under one divine purpose. I pray that you would see these redemptive threads that pass all the way through Genesis, that go all the way from Adam to Joseph. And I pray that you have a lot to discuss in this final group. Thanks.